impressed. You know, we're spending our entire lives Zooming, and you're adding the Zoom call to your life this morning. And for that, I'm both very impressed and very grateful. And I think the topic is important. And of course, very much where America is in all sorts of ways. Yes, I wrote a joke book, actually, which I'm sure Father Jason is zealously using every single time he preaches. It's a joke for every gospel and lectionary. So let me think of one which might work. So this is a link, this will appeal to your congregation. I mean, you know, this is a sort of, you've got to be a sort of a little bit linguistic to get this one. So two cats are swimming across the English Channel, one called 1, 2, 3 and the other one called Un, 2, 3. Which one wins and why? And the answer obviously is 1, 2, 3 because Un, 2, 3, cat sank. I know, isn't it dreadful? I can see you all wincing internally, you know. But yes, I love jokes, and for me, there was a piece recently in the New York Times about the importance of humor in the pandemic, and I think there's real truth in that. So I do invite you to. People say to me, "How do you remember a joke?" Just one little tip: the secret of remembering a joke is to tell it to somebody else. It can be somebody who's just heard it, doesn't matter who, within 15 minutes. So what you need to do is you need to get on the phone right now, call a friend and say, I've just got to tell you this joke about two cats swimming across English to that. Jokes, you've got to tell them soon afterwards though. All right, one last one. So this is all about Holy Thursday, which is a delicate time to choose, but you know, it's the Last Supper. St. Peter arrives at a restaurant and he goes up to the hostess and says, can I have a table, please, for 26? And the hostess counts all the people there and says, but there are only 13 of you. And St. Peter replies, yes, but we all like to sit down one side. I know, yes, you've got to know your Da Vinci paintings. Okay, right, so let's turn to the more serious matter of the seminary and enslaved persons. And we tend to use the language enslaved persons because in the end, first and foremost, these people were persons. And we don't define any person by their socioeconomic state of captivity. They are first and foremost persons who were enslaved. And the seminary was founded in 1823, as you all know, and the founders were all persons who had persons who were enslaved. You know, there's if you want to dig out a biography of Phillips Brooks. Now, Phillips Brooks is, of course, best known for A Little Town of Bethlehem, which he composed. He was a seminarian at Virginia Theological Seminary, went on to be a bishop. When he came to the campus in 1815, as a young seminarian from the north, he was just appalled by the sheer number of persons on the campus who were, as he put it, slaves. And he letters home to his father the way in which the seminary treated these enslaved persons abominably, really badly. So Brooks writes, you know, there was a student who wanted to hold a weekly meeting for enslaved people at the seminary, but other students told him he had to give it up or, quote, he will suffer. And it's just a reminder that, you know, here we are on the cusp of 200 years. And as we think about that anniversary, we need to confront, sure, grace is there in abundance, primarily through our remarkable alums who have made a difference around the country and around the world. But there's also simultaneously an awful lot of sin and wickedness in our past. I went back and read the centenary, the history written, the centenary, 100th, and it was straightforward hagiography. It was straightforward, you know, our founders were saints and they were remarkable people, and and we need to recognize that our past is much more complicated, and there's a lot of sin woven in with the grace of the story. So what we're trying to do, and one of the reasons why this is part of who we are now, is we're trying to make sure that we confront our past and repent of those aspects of the past that are wicked, and simultaneously commit to a different future. And part of that work has been reparations. So back in September 2019, do you remember those days? Those were the days before, when you didn't have to wear a mask and you were allowed to gather in a space with friends, and the pre-COVID days. We actually did commit to a reparations program where we set aside as a seminary $1.7 million as part from which the monies will be spent annually on a commitment to reparations. Now, reparations is a matter of controversy in the United States. It's attracted a lot of attention and debate. Of course, it goes all the way back to 1865 when, actually it was a group of African Americans who were the ones who proposed a reparation then, which would have been 40 acres and a mule for every freed enslaved person. That was sort of disintegrated after the assassination of Lincoln. But the principle that was established then, I think, was a right one. So let me just comment briefly on this as a Christian ethicist. I think every single person would recognize that a fundamental obligation of the social contract is you pay for the labor of those who did the work. It's wrong to run away from a restaurant after you've consumed a meal, and if, you find yourself in a situation where you can't necessarily pay the person who did the work, let's take for example, you get a builder in to build a swimming pool in your backyard, and that builder dies, having just completed it, but before you paid the builder. I think everybody would say, well, you just pay the estate. The work's still been done, the labor's been done, so of course you then pay into the estate. That's just the right thing to do. You wouldn't even think about it, really. You would just do it. So we as a seminary have to confront a reality that we have literally, and Phillips Brooks is interesting when he talks about it. He talks about hundreds of enslaved persons, but a significant number. They were all the persons who washed the clothes, prepared the meals, took care of the grounds. There were some skilled free men who also worked on the campus in all sorts of ways, but a lot of the labor was enslaved persons doing this work. And they've never been paid. Aspinwall Hall, the Italianate, extraordinary 1856 pinnacle building, we know was built by enslaved persons who were rented from the Mount Vernon estate. So we're very conscious of the fact that this achievement to human labor they've never been compensated. It's worse than that, of course. They were not only not compensated, but they were treated with cruelty and oppression and violence in a way that's the antithesis of the Christian gospel and the Christian witness. So for me, reparations in a funny sort of way isn't controversial. It's just called the right thing. You pay into the estate when you are unable to pay the persons who did the work at the time. And if I have a anxiety about the announcement of the seminary, is that the amount's too small. That the cost of the labor that the seminary exploited is a great deal more than the amount which thus far we've set aside for this work. But we have set something aside, and we would like to do something to get that right. Now, if you look closely at the announcement around our reparations announcement, we identified 5 features, of which, you know, the second is the particular needs of any descendants of enslaved persons that worked at the seminary. So we are interested in finding the descendants of those whose labor we exploited back in the 19th century and building a relationship with them. And then we're imagining that, you know, if they have a need, that we could, you know, contribute towards a medical bill perhaps, or, you know, student debt or whatever, you know, we would make a contribution, and we would do that in an ongoing way over many years as part of that relationship, as part of our debt to their forebears past. There were other things we listed, the particular needs emerging from local congregations linked with the seminary, Oakland Baptist Church and Mead Memorial, congregations that actually emerged when the seminary decided that St. Cyprian's Chapel, as the African Americans called it, the Chapel of Good Shepherd, as the white people called it, on the campus was demolished, and those congregations emerged connected to that change. So we had on the campus a congregation for African Americans, and they sort of dispersed, and we want to build relationships with those congregations. We are very conscious of the story of our African American alumni and alumni. You know, the story of the seminary is that we actually did not have African Americans on the campus as seminarians. Interestingly, we did have Africans, Liberians, but we didn't have African Americans on the campus until the merger with the Bishop Payne Divinity School. And of course, one of the first alums was Bishop John Walker, who became the Bishop of Washington. And if you look at the story of our alums since Bishop John Walker through to, I fear, the present day, the story has been difficult. In 2009, we asked Joseph Constant to write a book, which was primarily interviews with our African American alums, and they tell a story of extraordinary pain. And that is the continuing sin. You know, it wasn't like, you know, the consequences of enslaved persons being exploited, and then the Jim Crow segregation era, and then the present day. It's sort of, there is a continuity. It's not like, you know, that was, my predecessors were responsible for that, not me. You know, I can't say that, because the shadow of the sin impacts the present day. And it is a matter of deep concern to me, and that African Americans, I spoke to one who graduated last summer, and I said, so how's your experience been here? And he said, well, to be honest, Dean, the African American students feel like they're physically distancing most of the time. And so what's going on there? Because a lot of the seminarians are, you know, we have the political spectrum. We're a national seminary, so you know, but there are lots amongst them who would say, you know, I aspire to have good relationships with, and I like diversity, and I'm committed to inclusion. I believe in justice, but actually, the way they're experienced by our African American students is they find it difficult, and you know, it's the sort of, and we're increasingly alert to this as a country. It's the way in which we make assumptions and asides that constantly denigrate and hurt. So, so we are, part of the goals of the reparation funds is to support African American alumni, especially those in historic Black congregations. And then we had 2 others, the raising up of African American clergy in the Episcopal Church. We need to increasingly look like the country we're seeking to serve, and that isn't the case. And then, sure, other activities and programs that promote justice and inclusion. Now, the reason why we had those 5 goals for the $1.7 million reparations is because, of course, on the one that I would love to see materialize, and that is that we actually do try and pay for the exploited and cruelly used labor of those who worked so hard in the 19th century, and reach out to their estates and honor the descendants in some way. That's hard to do because, of course, we've now got to find out who these people were. And do you know, there are constant moments of excruciating agony for me as we do this work. We've been, since after we made the announcement in September 2019, we employed 4 genealogists to basically work on identifying the names and seeking to discover their subsequent genealogy, their ancestry, and who their descendants might be. And that, you know, and on the way, it's a bi-directional work. So in other words, what we're doing is, on the one hand, we search for the clues and the names and the documentation of persons who were around in the 19th century and we know worked on the campus of the seminary. So that's one direction. We go from the past to the present. But the other direction, of course, is there are lots of old African-American families still in the neighborhood who know that a grandfather or even a great-grandfather worked or had worked at the seminary. So we're going from their experiences and memories, you know, back to the past. So we're trying to, it's bi-directional, from the past to the present and from the present back to the past. And, you know, it's coordinated all out of the Office of the Archives. We have 2 people dedicated internally to this work and then 4 genealogists. And if you are interested in learning more about this, do feel free to email Chris Pote, who is our archivist, who works very closely with Ebony Davis, who is the archivist for the African American Episcopal Historical Collection. I'm going to share some results with you of this. And I must admit, I find this extraordinarily holy and also salutary work. You know, I think every human life is afraid of being forgotten. You know, you want somebody to remember you when you're in glory. You don't want your name to completely disappear. I think most of us feel that. And therefore finding a name and being able to say, this is who this person was, actually, I think is extraordinarily powerful. So how's it going? Well, so getting back to the past, it's untidy, you know, and literally you're often dealing with fragments. An important source, which is publicly available, is of course the Alexandria Gazette. And you'll find that in the 19th century, there are large numbers of advertisements placed for enslaved persons to come and work in people's homes. And so what happened is, you know, an ad, a Bland, B-L-A-N-D, who worked at the seminary, clearly had a responsibility for filling vacancies as they arose. So Bland advertises for temporary enslaved persons to work at the seminary. And then what the genealogist did is actually found a book, a very interesting book by Scott Casper, written in the 19th century, entitled Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon. And Bland's name appears in there, and there's talk of how the seminary received enslaved persons through the Mount Vernon estate. So you have 2 clues then, and then embedded in a footnote, which then led to archival research at Mount Vernon, letters were then tracked down between John Augustine Washington III. Now, John Augustine Washington III is the great nephew of George Washington and the then owner of the Mount Vernon estate. And he actually, I mean, you know, would advertise the availability of enslaved laborers for the neighborhood and for the region. And so embedded in all that, we find both in correspondence and in this book, we find our first 3 names of enslaved persons. Julia Parker, she was actually born, now here's an irony, she was born April the 18th, 1823, the year of the seminary's founding. She was hired out in 1844 for a total of 3 months work at the seminary, earning $12 for her enslaver for John Augustine Washington III. She was 19 when she came to the seminary. And I don't know about you, my son's 24. And you do find yourself just pausing and thinking about that young life, a teenager. And you think a little bit about what was it like? How did she cope? She was soon after sold to an unnamed judge in Jefferson County, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. Do you know, the seminary is going to list Julia Parker. We're going to make sure that that we list every name of every person we learn about as we do this work. This name is going to be remembered because she toiled on the campus of the seminary and her labor was never recognized, and she was exploited. You know, 2 other names come through the same source. Unfortunately, they're incomplete. We have a Millie and a Sophie. We know that Millie was born in 1839. And we also know that she too was hired out by John Augustine Washington III. When she was 16 to 18 years old, she was hired out to the seminary. And Sophie, we know nothing more about. We just have a name. It's in the correspondence between John Augustine Washington III and his wife. And it's all about the delivery arrangements. He talks about how she was going to get delivered to the campus. Now, this is salutary and difficult work that we're doing. It is work that that I really do think is holy. You know, there's a biblical tradition about the significance of the name being remembered and honored, which is part of what we're doing here. We're making sure these people are not forgotten. And as we do this work, although we're especially interested in persons who are enslaved, we're also interested in persons who worked on the campus during the Jim Crow era, where the exploitation was different, but nevertheless cruel. And so we're gathering a whole picture of our past that's a really important part of our self-understanding of our understanding of ourselves in the present. And that's the important thing about this work in the past, is that actually you understand more carefully the present. And of course, you make certain commitments to a different future. You know, I met recently with the granddaughter of a gentleman who was a sexton on the campus of the seminary for 20 years and lived on the campus but we don't know where. You know, and it's illustrative of how the seminary actually puts quite a lot of resources into collecting the story of our present so the future knows about it, and a lot of resources into collecting the details of our past. But the past is the story of the faculty, which was white, of employees, which was white, but the sexton, who was African American, is invisible. So it's not just the story of the seminary and enslaved persons, it's the story of the seminary and African Americans in particular. And it is a story that's sobering and difficult for us to confront. And therefore, as we mark our 200th year, we're playing around with a whole set of instruments to make sure that, you know, unlike the Goodwin history after 100 years, we're making sure that this is a moment when, for example, we're going to do a play about the history of the seminary, and that play will include the stories of the seminary and African Americans. We're commissioning a painting by an African American artist that actually makes us think a little bit about the story of the seminary and African Americans. We're actually looking quite hard at certain spaces on the campus. So if you haven't visited the campus recently, unfortunately, you have to wait till COVID's over in 2029 or wherever it'll be. And I hope it's a bit sooner than that, just FYI. We might have to go through the spell where the vaccine all gives us a second nose, and although it adds to our capacity to smell really effectively, you know, we will want to get the other side of that. So, I mean, so whenever it's over, but when you do visit, and incidentally, we are, just a little aside, because this gives you an opportunity to go to Scott Lounge. The 1823, those of you who know that we have a venue where you can get a beverage, a gin and tonic all the way through to a soda. We're opening up the terrace as of Wednesday, October the 7th, 5 to 10 p.m, Wednesday through Sunday. You'll have to, you know, that we've created a terrace and it's only outdoor dining, but you will be able to get a beverage and come in your bubble with your spouse or your friend who you created a bubble with and be present on the terrace. But I mention all this because you're next door to Scott Lounge. So what we're also thinking about as we do this, mark this 200 years, is the messaging of this institution has been dominated by this reverence for our founders, and they've been honored everywhere. And so we're playing around with, so Scott Lounge has evolved from a setting in which, you know, the bishops have been replaced with a Della Robbia, which was donated generously to the seminary, which captures our incarnational faith. And at the other end, an extraordinary painting by Terry Lind, an African-American artist from Atlanta, of a baptism, African-American congregation being baptized in the river, capturing our commitment to baptism, and by virtue of baptism, we're all called to honor and recognize the dignity of every human being. And then where Bishop Meade, who was our founder and apologist for slavery, his portrait used to hang, we've actually replaced it with a mirror. So you pause and you see the continuing sin that infects us all, and our commitment to a different future from the past that we've lived with. And then if you walk into the refectory, you still have the deans there, and you have the bishops who weren't owners of enslaved persons, and you have the faculty. So you still have a celebration of the communion of saints. And what do we do with Bishop Mead's portrait? Well, that'll probably move into Oakwood, which is going to evolve into a conference centre, and that will have the story of the seminary and include a recognition that Bishop Mead played a pivotal role in our founding, but was also an apologist for an institution that was evil and participated fully in that institution. So that's how we're trying to navigate this moment. And that's how we're trying to actually make sure that, and I'll take questions, but let me just conclude with this. In the deanery is being renovated. It's a gorgeous house in so many ways, but it's a very public house. My wife and I have many guests passing through that house. And so what we're trying to do is create a private space for the dean's family, and then a public space for entertaining, where there's a few more restrooms and a catering kitchen and things like that being added on. And in the big entertaining room, which Jason will know and Jeremy will know and David will know and Chrissy would know, in the big entertaining room, it's called the Mead Room because Bishop Mead's portrait hangs in it. And in the renovated deanery, we're going to rename that room, and we're going to call it the Julia Parker Room. We're going to, Julia was 19 when she worked at the seminary. But in 2023, students will gather in the Julia Parker Room. And I pray and hope that that hopefully we'll meet a descendant where that news can be shared, and that somewhere in the communion of the saints, the message gets to Julia that her name has been remembered and the seminary is grateful for what she did. I'll now mute myself and hand it back to Jason. Very much for sharing that, and I can't agree with you more. I think you are utterly right about the connection between the inheritance one has had and the present, and that works both in good ways and bad ways. You know, a fortunate background in inheritance leads to a stronger and more stable present, and an inheritance of disadvantage and exploitation and abuse leads to instability in the present. And I think that's a completely accurate read. I was reading recently Austin Channing Brown's book, I'm Still Here. And she talks a little bit about, you know, her experience of living in life as an African-American in a Christian organization, interestingly. And for me, it was very illuminating, you know, and the ways in which her experience of the world is so different from mine. And one's temptation all the time is to assume that everybody's experience is like mine. And you suddenly realize, no. I mean, I know it sounds like this is the expletive obvious, but, you know, I needed that text to live into. And I think you're so right that part of the duty of this moment is actually to restore, hence, you know, the importance of the term reparations, the honoring of those who built America. I mean, you know, the enslaved persons literally built the seminary, literally built it, you know. And that's an extraordinary achievement, and they should be honored. And that's part of what it is. And I think you're right to say, you know, my prayer is in the act of honoring the past, so we can honor those who are living in the present. And yeah, I think it's humbling work, and it's important work. And I really appreciate everything you said. So let me talk a little bit about the discernment process. We took a view as a seminary that what we didn't want to do is what Georgetown did. What Georgetown decided to do was find out everything they could about the past and save the question of any reparations to the end. We took the view that actually what we should do is commit to reparations at the outset and then do the work about the past. What we wanted to try and do was decide that if we're going to do this work, you know, these resources will be a commitment to some sort of restoration, some sort of repair, some sort of reparation. So, and that was very much largely a conversation at the board level. Then once we announced it, we then started the work of getting into the details of the story. So this is where we are now catching up with Georgetown. Georgetown's ahead of us on this. Georgetown, of course, had that extraordinary episode where a large number of enslaved persons were in effect sold to keep the university afloat. So we started our own sort of, having made, so we reversed the narrative. One thing the seminary had decided, and I want to just stress, you know, the work of acknowledging the sins of our past is one that was very much on the mind of my predecessor, Martha Horn. She actually got the first grant from the Carpenter Foundation, which enabled an employee to be dedicated to the multicultural diversity. She worked very intentionally with the students of colour. She was very responsive to their concerns. Another key person was the Reverend Dr. Marge McNaughton Ayres, who played a very pivotal role in this season. And you know, and there's a sense in which, so the seminary was already committed to both the work of historical genesis and also the work of transforming the present and moving into the future. The opportunity to have a fund dedicated reparations was created by the Board of Trustees. And then having done that, we now have a program we've got to deliver on, which has the advantages of acknowledging the names and identities of those involved, and also trying to build relationships with those families in the present. The last thing I'll say, a key part of the discernment, which was shared across the community, faculty, staff, students, and board members, is how do you mark a 200th? And one response that emerged in the strategic planning process of 2016 was, let's not just do a big party and a big celebration. Let's recognize this anniversary for what it is, a complex moment where we need to recognize that the grace that's part of our past is also mired and interwoven with sin, and acknowledgement of that sin was an important part of this too. That so let me just talk generally. The labyrinth is lovely, incidentally, And we do encourage guests onto the campus. Obviously, if you go near somebody, please put on a mask. But apart from that, walking around the campus in this season is one of the delights. And walking around the labyrinth is, I think, one of the loveliest parts of the campus. It's located down behind the deanery. And it is worth a visit if you've not been there before. As Rich would know, I've been at Virginia Theological Seminary for some time, and I don't think I ever really entirely appreciated that there was an African-American place of worship in the 19th century, which the seminary had demolished. It was called St. Cyprian's, which is where the African-Americans preferred term, and the diocese records documented as the Chapel of the Good Shepherd. And I still haven't quite got to the significance of that difference and whether there's any documentation about why exactly that difference emerges. But we did want to recognize the reality that this place of worship was part of our past, and we wanted to do so in a naming recognition moment. The labyrinth itself is a combination of brick from the new chapel, 2015 chapel, and from the 1881 chapel. So it's all made of brick from chapels as part of the symbolism of walking the labyrinth. And it was, of course, blessed, as you say, at a neighborhood opportunity where many African-American families who were part of St. Cyprian's, had grandparents and others who were part of that congregation, participated. And the answer, I'm pleased to report, is yes. Relationships have continued to develop between those families and the seminary, and the work of genealogists who are working from the present back are spending a lot of time working with those families. So actually relationships are probably deeper now than they've ever been before.
Good.
Donzel Small went to glory in 20... I pause. Next time, Rich, you're on the campus, go to the chapel garden and you'll find his name's right at the top. He worked on the grounds of the seminary for many, many years, and his cremains are in the chapel garden, which he cared for, and he was the first person to be placed in that space. To know, but I actually appreciate your suggestion about reaching out to the family, and I will take that idea away and talk more to Joseph Constant and to the genealogist about that.
Good, thank you.
Thank you for that question. So as you might know, the seminary strives to, and always has under my predecessors and back several decades, to make theological education affordable. It was a mantra of Mary Hicks, who I see on the school, that we do strive to debt-free theological education, so you don't have to take out a loan to become a priest. We've simplified things a little bit under Vice President Jackie Ballou, Mary's successor. And now the situation is, those who have household incomes of less than $150,000 and assets, if you're single, excluding your personal home or pensions of less than $200,000, every seminarian receives free accommodation, free tuition, free meal plan, and $4,000 towards your health insurance. So we're trying, in the spirit of what Martha and Mary did in the past, very much keep to that commitment of the cost of attending the seminary are sufficient, are covered. And I'm pleased to report that a trend that started over a decade ago has grown. The incoming class is almost 1/3 students of colour, and the total student body is running at 27% students of colour. And we've seen a significant growth in African Americans. And I did inquire as to why this might be. And a factor is that I think our reparations announcement has helped. And it's helped in this respect. And that is that a lot of our African American seminarians are searching for a place that, you know, they can trust. They know that the intent in the place, you know, is I'm still a white Anglo grey old man, you know, running the place, and we are in so many ways a white institution. But I think they understand and appreciate that this is a place that really would like to be one that is serious, deeply serious about the work of, you know, not just being superficially inclusive, but being seriously anti-racist. And I think that that's a shift, you know, which institutions need to be sensitive to and need to learn from. And so the news is good. We are making, I think, progress. We've got the student body, it all depends how you count them. We have about 50 or so students on the doctoral programs, and then probably about 140 or so in our residential programs. So we're about 200 or so, a total community. Much for the invitation. It's been an honor.